All right, welcome everybody to another installment of our Fed Steer Shootout educational videos. Today we've got a guest with us that is going to talk about a topic that is pretty complex, but a very important topic in the cattle feeding industry. And we're glad to have Mark Clark with us today with Professional Commodities Management. Mark, sure appreciate you taking the time to put some information together to educate our young people and be a part of our program. So we've also got Lee Mayo again with us at HRC Feed Yards, and he's going to kind of help us maybe to translate some of this stuff into what he does too, and his relationship with Mark. So with that, I guess, Mark, I'll just kind of turn it over to you.
Well, my name is Mark Clark. I'm a commodity broker here in Dodge City. We've come together at this meeting and everything, and we're just going to talk briefly about the basics. We've spent a lot of time, money, and research in the cattle industry on putting together a good feeding animal. But there's three things that are important in that to succeed in cattle feeding. And first, of course, is your first cost. And then the feed costs, which that's Lee's department, and then marketing, which also involves Lee, but it also usually involves some kind of risk management. And we're going to focus a little bit on price risk and managing that risk the best that we can. And I'm going to be pretty basic here, but the first thing that I wanted to talk about is, what is hedging? Okay, hedging is simply you taking an opposite but equal position in the futures market from your present cash position. Now, way back in 1912, the mercantile was established to do this very thing, and believe it or not, it was for eggs and milk, okay, and butter. That's what the Merc first started. Now, in today, they pretty much at the Merc trade anything that you can feed, plant it, or dig it up. The Chicago Mercantile trades that commodity. The cattle in particular are what we're going to focus on mostly here. I'll talk just briefly about corn. Right now, that's a four-letter word in our industry. But the cash market, which you look over there to the left, that's where you are right now. You own the inventory. So your risk, of course, is if the cash market goes lower, your price goes lower and you get less for your animal. So how do we offset that? First, I want to talk about the futures market. The futures market, we would sell a contract, and I'll show you later in a slide here about the size of that contract. But we go what is called in terminology, when we sell the futures market, we are essentially setting a price for some time in the future, and our terms are we are short the market. Now, how does that benefit us? It benefits us if the futures markets go down, we gain in price, which goes towards the cattle. Now, in the futures market, like in any market, there always has to be an equal and opposite position against your position. So the user of the inventory, let's say the packer, because he's the one that's going to essentially take ownership of the animal and slaughter it and sell it, he's on the other side of this, or it would be speculators on the other side. The risk is in an up market, okay, for us, it's in a down market for him. So his cash position is if the market goes higher. His risk is if the market goes higher. So he's a buyer of the contract most of the time. Anybody that's on the inventory end of the cattle. So if the markets go up, he gains. If the markets go down, we do if we're short the futures. Simply put, we are taking a forward price position, but we're using the futures market to do it. Okay, some futures terms that I just talked about was a futures contract is an obligation to buy or sell a commodity that meets a set standard of some future date. When Lee calls me up and he says, all right, we got a set of calves and they're going to come out the 1st of June or something, we look at the June futures board and we look at its current price. If that's at a price where we can make that work, where these cattle will make a little money, hopefully break even and make a little money, we would be sellers. And you look there to your left where it says sell, the terminology is we are now short the market. And like I said earlier, if the price in the futures market goes down, we gain in dollars. And the way to get out of that at said point in time, when Lee would perhaps call me up and say, okay, these cattle are on the show list and the packers agreed to buy them, we buy that contract back and we have no more obligation. Or we make a delivery. The delivery process is a whole nother 30-minute talk over the do's and the don'ts there. But to go on, if you're a buyer in the futures market, and a lot of times since we're in the cattle industry, the buying side that we'll be on is usually corn. So we buy the corn. We are essentially what they say long. So if the price in the futures market goes up, we gain in dollars. Same thing, if we would liquidate that, Lee buys some corn and wants out of those futures positions, we'll sell it. Very rarely do we take delivery in the corn market. Contract sizes for live cattle are 40,000 pounds per contract. And that pretty much meets a standard load of fat cattle that are sold to the packer. Feeder cattle, 50,000 pounds per contract. If you look at that's about right with the weights of one load that sits on a truck that comes into the yard. And the corn is 5,000 bushels per contract. That feed 5,000 bushels of corn, and Lee, you can tell me whether I'm right or wrong. I may be wrong, but that essentially feed about 90 to 100 head of cattle, somewhere in there.
I mean, the old rules of thumb are a yearling takes 55 bushels and a calf takes 65 bushels. But yes, it's pretty close.
Right. And that is how we approach hedging using pounds, and everything's about pounds. In the end, it's all about dollars and pounds. I'm going to switch a little bit and talk just briefly about options. Options are another way that we can use to protect prices. Options are they're unlimited liability and unlimited profit potential when you buy or purchase them, but there is cost association. Okay, the two types of options that you can use is call, which we set a ceiling price. It gives the buyer the right to buy, be long, like we talked earlier. The underlying futures contract at the futures price is higher, but not the obligation if the price is lower. And value goes up if the market goes up. Value goes down if the market goes down. Options, just like the futures market, are time sensitive. They only last for the time that you buy them. If we buy June options, they expire the first week of June. Okay, and puts are the exact opposite of the calls, and this is what we deal mostly in by putting a floor price. It gives the buyer the right to sell, be short, the underlying futures contract if the futures price is lower, but not an obligation if the futures price is higher. And same goes if the value of the futures market goes up if the market goes down. The value of the put goes down if the market goes up. That sounds complicated, but it's essentially like purchasing like insurance on something. So types of options, premiums. This is something that gets a lot of people hung up. It's the cost of options are similar to insurance premiums. I mean, we have the same terminology. Time value, how long or the duration, how far out, in other words, determines the price. Like if I'm buying a December cattle option, it's going to be more expensive than buying a June just because of the time. Volatility in the market. as you know, we've been pretty volatile in the futures market in the cattle. We've been in a pretty tight range, but it's been pretty volatile. So those options are high. And an intrinsic value is, simply put, intrinsic value is just they use a historical look at where have these options prices been prior. So when you're looking at options and you look at what they cost, when you're talking to your broker, he'll say, well, at what strike price do you want? That would be similar to just like if the June futures board closed today at 121, we might look at an option strike price at 120, and then we'd look at the cost of that option. A lot of this sounds foreign. It's not easy to just grasp right away, but essentially what you're doing is you're paying a premium to be short the market. But if the market rallies, it can't go against you more than you've put up for the option. Okay. Types of options. You have the right as an owner of an option, like if you're buying puts, you have three things you can do with it. You can let it expire, and there's no other follow-up needed. You can sell it back, just like we do the futures market when we want out. And then we can exercise those, which we can turn that option into a futures position if we bought it at any time that we choose to. One of the things that I wanted to talk a little bit about, and this is something that has been a big challenge, especially the past 6 months, is basis. And when you buy an option to protect price on your cattle in the future, or you just simply sell a futures contract to protect price in the future, you are from that point on a basis trader because you have essentially set your price. Then the basis becomes very important. Okay, the basis is the difference between your local price, meaning what in the feed yard, what the packer's willing to pay us, or what we trade cattle for that week, and the futures price at that date and time. So a lot of things are made up to change that changes your basis. Of course, going in, that's your transportation costs, insurance. All these things go into the difference between cash and basis. In short, basis is simply just the cash minus the futures market. This chart right here, I pulled up and put on here. This is as current as I could use. And of course, you can see that the basis doesn't always channel right along with the futures market. In theory, that it's supposed to always come together at the time that the futures contract is, you're in that, like the 1st of April, we are in what we call delivery date. If you're short the April futures market, the basis, which is the bottom line there in that chart, is your cash market. The solid blue line is the futures market. They are supposed to come together, but you can see, like way back in July, how if you can see how wide basis got using the April contract, but you can see what's starting to happen here now as we move on. We're getting closer and closer. Historical basis charts are very important, and that's a lot of what when Lee and I talk and when I talk to other hedgers, that's the one thing we talk about. Where's the basis normally at this time? And you look at 3-year, 5-year, 10-year, whatever. I usually tend to use 3 years because so many things change. But basis is essential to understanding where the likelihood you are going to be in the cash market relative to the time frame that you're marketing your cattle. So all these things that I've mentioned, I know I went through them pretty quickly, but if you simply went back, I don't know what I just hit there. If you simply go back and look at the futures market, which is something, this right here is pretty much, if you have an understanding here, you should have a pretty good understanding of what we're trying to do, and that's we're essentially establishing a price for the cattle in the future, and we're using the futures market to do that. But a lot of things go into that, and right now, probably the last thing I talked about was probably the most important to us right now, because it's pretty wide, is the basis. And sometimes it's very predictable, and sometimes it's not that predictable. But I'm hoping that as we get into summer, we have more of a normal basis as we move forward. I will say this: the futures and hedging, and whether you choose to use the futures market or options to protect your cattle prices, the one thing that we're trying to do is really to protect ourselves from outside things that can dramatically move the market. Like in 19, in August, the Holcomb plant fire caused a dramatic effect in cash. COVID-19, you go back even further, things like BSE and stuff like that. These $10, $15, 100-weight swings in the cattle market are essentially what we're trying to protect from. But that's pretty much it in a nutshell. I don't know if you guys got any add tos or anything you want me to discuss.
Well, no, Mark, I think let's just kind of talk for just a second, and
Sure.
I'll interject. And I think you've done a great job with, your charts and stuff here. And I'm just going to interject about 4 or 5 different things here. And I'm number one. I mean, this is going out to, all age of children and kids, and even for that matter, I mean, Mark, heck, you and I are kids in the futures market. There's been people trading this thing 75 years, right? I mean, here you and I are both around 50 years old, and hell, we're still considered kids when you get to talking some of these sorts of things. So as you all are looking at this, don't be overwhelmed by it. And I think, Trey will interject here in a minute too, I have a feeling, but the thing to understand about any kind of a market, and it's stock market, futures market, anything, the best thing you can do is get a professional that this is what they do to help you with risk management. I mean, because that's basically all we're trying to do, is we're trying to leave ourselves open for as much profit potential as we can stand on the risk side. If I can stand to lose, and I'm just trying to break this down, that if I can afford to lose $100 a head on fat cattle without it really affecting my livelihood or my life or whatever, you try to protect it at that level, if you understand what I'm trying to get at. And then you leave yourself open to as much profit as you can possibly get. And that's the trade-off. And everybody's situation is different in terms of how much risk or reward you want to try to achieve out of the market. And that is why, again, coming back to it, why, just for example, Mark Clark is our commodity broker here at HRC Feed Yards. A lot of times I know exactly what I'm doing as I'm talking to customers and want to do things, but Mark will tell you there's times we have 45-minute conversations about corn, cattle, etc., trying to develop some kind of a game plan to either minimize loss to get us through a bad deal in terms of COVID-19 or the plant fire at Holcomb, or to be able to maximize our profit potential with very, very little risk. And that's in a nutshell what we're trying to do with all this stuff. And it gets very, very complicated. And I mean, we can have three-way option strategies with a short futures on top of it all. And I mean, we can, trust me, guys. I mean, people that have been, Mark and I both been involved in the futures market for 30 plus years, I think is pretty safe to say, since we were both in our early 20s. And I mean, we learn something new every day, and we come up with another strategy all the time. And this is a deal. There's no way we're going to cover it in 20 minutes. The takeaway message should just be a basic kind of understanding, like Mark said, that you are trying to forward contract your cattle essentially at a price that you're comfortable with, as well as the next takeaway needs to be get a professional involved in this. This is why you feed cattle at HRC feed yards, so that Mark and I can work together to try to maximize your profit potential or minimize your risk. However you want to look at it. I think that's it in a nutshell. Would you not agree, Mark?
Oh, absolutely. You know, and you mentioned it. What's a good mention there is this is a very fluid situation all the time. We've got to deal with different things that we just have to consider, you know, and it's one of these deals that you definitely have to be able to make adjustments too. Now, some guys just like the hard line. They want to sell the futures and go on, and that's good. That's great. That's simple. But when it comes down to, you know, like I was talking to last, their basis, it's good to have an understanding of what's going on there. You could be very disappointed, you know, if you're marketing your cattle and you expect the basis to be in your favor, but the time frame usually doesn't, you know, like July or September are two basis time frames that are usually pretty risky, you know. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, I started feeding cattle for myself a little bit, and you know, here I was supposed to have all this experience. Well, I certainly had to learn. I certainly had to learn. It doesn't always work that way, you know. No. And but it's a great experience, though. I have no regrets in learning it the way that I did, you know. And I'm glad I had people to lead me along, especially on the feeding end. You know, certainly had people say, I don't know if you want to do that, Mark. You know, I don't know if you want to feed a 650-pound heifer in the summer. You know? Right. So anyway. Yeah, you know, and it's just I mean, and this is part of the business, right? And I mean, and I think that's the takeaway message for the kids that are watching this. And I know there's going to be some adults watching it too. And again, the one thing that I will reiterate with anybody is about all this is Mark and I both enjoy talking about the markets. We enjoy visiting about them and trying to teach people and trying to learn ourselves, because I mean, again, I've learned as much from people about the markets when you never even expected you were going to learn something. I mean, that's kind of a crazy thing is, you know, somebody, you'll be talking to somebody and it'll be a customer of mine that's never really done this all of a sudden. And they all of a sudden just bring up a point. And it's like, wow, I should have thought about that, you know. Right. And I know it happens all the time because there's just kind of crazy things that happen in the world. And I mean, COVID-19 is a great example of that, right? But anyway, as we move forward, I mean, that would be what I'd reiterate is please understand your forward contracting the cattle. Please understand that we're here to try to help you any way we can. And Mark is behind me, and I'll be kind of the front person on the deal and talk to Mark. But you know, Mark handles, how many different feed yards do you handle these kind of things for, Mark? I have 6 different feed yards in the Dodge, you know, around the Dodge area within 100 miles.
Right. Between Dodge City, Scott City, you know, so I mean, this is what we do for a living. And it's just like, I wouldn't recommend anybody that doesn't have a lot of knowledge in the stock market to go open an E-Trade account and start trading stocks tomorrow. I mean, that's a little bit dangerous if you don't understand what you're doing and what you're getting into. And And the great thing about us here at the feed yard is as long as you have cattle here and we're truly hedging things, I mean, we cover the margin calls, and I mean, we could have a whole 2-hour conversation about margin calls and getting blown out of the market and some of the crazy things that can go on when that happens. Cause there's been hundreds of $1 million margin calls in certain days, hasn't there, Mark? And
Yeah. Oh
I
yeah.
mean, fortunes are won and lost in these markets, but it's actually not as dangerous and I guess I say that to get to this point, that it still is our friend as far as commodity producers, whether you're a corn farmer, a cattleman, you're feeding your own cattle, you're selling calves, you're doing whatever. These futures markets are there to try to prevent risk for you. And if you use a professional and somebody that understands the market, I think that can very easily, you can be very, very successful in marketing your livestock other than just loading your calves up and going to the sale barn and praying. That's there's one way of saying that. And, you know, there's something to be said for that because there's not a lot of risk. You don't have to make many decisions except which day you're going to sell them. But there also isn't much marketing in that. And I guess I like to try to market no matter what it is I'm selling. I want to try to take full advantage of the market every time I sell anything. And that's from cattle to anything, basically. I mean, when I'm
No,
trading a pickup, I don't want to sell it too cheap.
yeah, that's a good point, Lee. And I think is a good takeaway that for anybody that would be watching that, being a cattle marketer or whatever commodity you're marketing, to be active in marketing that product and looking at risk management tools and not just be a price taker. I think that's important to be engaged in what is going on in the industry and what may be affecting the futures market and ultimately the what you're going to receive for your product. I think is important to think about.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I guess a question might be a pretty simple question, but in terms of just a typical pen of cattle situation, what commodities would you be trading? You mentioned that you would, there's a lot of different things that you can trade on the futures, but for this application and the people that might be watching this, what commodities or contracts would you be looking at for putting a pen of cattle on feed?
Oh, it's straight up easier, cleaner, and just easier to track. Just straight up sell the futures market in the time that you think you're going to market your cattle. And Lee can look at the cattle. I mean, he's put enough cattle on. He can probably look at them and figure out, what their gains are going to be and when they're going to come out in that time frame. And that's the futures contract. Like if they're going to come out, sometime in June, we would sell the June board. And like today we were at close to 121. If that holds all the money together that you need it to, that's pretty close to your break even. We would just simply sell the board, which is 40,000 contracts per contract, 40,000. So typically, you're looking at one pen of cattle is probably going to be 2 contracts to cover
two to three.
Yeah.
So Lee, from your point of view, aside from cattle, what other commodities or contracts would you deal with on a regular basis?
Well, I mean, here we keep it pretty simple as well. Of course, I'm buying cattle for the feed yard all the time, and as a matter of fact, that's one of the phone calls I missed was our order buyer at Syracuse today. But I will look at feeder cattle. I will look at live cattle, and of course, corn. And once in a while, we'll trade in the bean market, just because we're trying to offset some prices of soybeans. Because as we would have learned in an earlier presentation from Garrett, that basically all your feed ingredients are based on the price of corn. Be what I'd tell you. And just kind of as a reminder of what we talked about on that call with Garrett Parsons, our nutritionist, but also all of our protein sources are based basically on the price of soybeans. So whether you feed soybean meal or not, you can still use soybeans to protect yourself as terms of the protein that you need for your ration, and corn. And seriously, and it doesn't matter if you're talking alfalfa, hay, or wheat straw. It all ties back to the corn market in a roundabout sort of way. And it's really impossibly crazy to be able to explain that. But I mean, if corn is $6 a bushel, like is what it takes to buy it here in Western Kansas today, straw's higher, alfalfa's higher, wheat's higher, it's all higher. And it doesn't matter what you're buying, but it's basis the corn market in one percentage at different percentages again, or not. So we trade the live cattle, the feeder cattle, corn primarily, and occasionally we'll jack around in the bean market once in a while. But
Yeah.
Well, that
and
sounds good.
we can also do some crazy things. I mean, just for one more example, I mean, it would have been a pretty smart thing for Lee to do, to buy all of his diesel fuel and oil and natural gas on the futures board here, about 35 days ago, but before that winter cold snap, because that could have saved all of us a pile of money if I'd have done that. And it's out there to do. I mean, like Mark said, I mean, they'll trade puppy dog tails in Chicago. They're not afraid to trade at all.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. We had guys were, what it costs to run those boilers in your, your feed mill.
That's exactly right.
All that stuff, all that natural gas and everything. So you can get as complex and involved as you want, but I always tell everyone, when you're first getting started in risk management and everything, the simpler the better, till you kind of see how things move in the market. And unfortunately, the only way to really learn to do this is to get involved. If you're just going to sit and just say, well, I'll just put it on paper, it's a lot different putting it on paper than being involved. And it's great to hear that you young guys are getting involved by putting cattle on feed now. And shoot, and a few years down, you'll be old hat a few years down the road, and you will know the risks, and you will understand what needs to be done. And that's great. I think it's a great thing.
Yeah, well, I would just kind of echo what both of you guys have said, and for anybody that is paying attention to this, that I hope through this presentation you've got an understanding of the basics of the futures market, but probably more than anything, know that you can trust in guys like Lee and Mark when you put cattle on feed to handle these things and set a strategy for risk management. And these guys live it every day. This is what they do and what they think about all day. And I would sure be cautious of trying to do it on your own. And again, by putting feed on cattle at a place like HRC, they're going to take care of a lot of things, a lot of these things for you. So with that, do you guys have anything else to add in there?
No, I hope I didn't muddy the water too much. But I don't know. Having people involved is just a great thing. This is a great program.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you all know how I feel about the program, so I would absolutely concur with Mark. I mean, and this is what Trey, you and I have tried to do from the beginning of this, is make this a very, very educational process. And this is a subject that, I mean, again, we could talk about this one for years and years and years and years. And the unfortunate thing about this one is what today might be completely useless and meaningless information tomorrow. I mean, and it just may be, because as the world turns and as we go more and more to the things that we have, the things that we used to pay attention to, Mark and I, even in our short careers in this 30 years ago, so many of them things are just absolutely irrelevant today and just don't matter. And I mean, what's it going to be next? I mean, flying cars, I'm sure, I guess, I don't know, but I mean, we've had people say that, but I mean, it's seriously, it's that true. So,
Sure. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank both of you for your time and education for these young people, and sure appreciate you putting thought and effort into helping us to hopefully create better cattlemen and particularly our Hereford breeds. So thanks again, and sure hope you guys have a good rest of your afternoon.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
thank you.
You bet. Bye.